The afternoon sun filtered through the terminal windows as Margaret Foster checked her boarding pass. One more time. Gate 47, seat 12. She had saved for months for this trip to visit her daughter in Seattle. And despite her exhaustion from caring for baby Emma all week, she felt a quiet joy. Her daughter Sarah needed the break, and Margaret cherished every moment with her granddaughter. As she settled into her window seat, Margaret gently adjusted the sleeping infant in her arms. Emma's tiny fingers curled against the soft pink blanket, her breath coming in peaceful sighs. The plane was filling quickly, passengers shuffling down the aisle with their carry-ons and hurried expressions. "Excuse me, ma'am. I believe you're in my seat." Margaret looked up to see a man in his early 40s standing in the aisle. He wore a crisp light blue shirt, sleeves rolled to his elbows, and dark slacks. His hair was neatly styled, and despite the authority in his voice, his eyes held a certain gentleness. "Oh, I'm so sorry," Margaret said, fumbling for her boarding pass with one hand while supporting Emma with the other. "Let me just check." The man, whose name was David Harrison, glanced at the sleeping baby and then at the woman before him. She looked to be in her late 50s, with kind eyes that crinkled at the corners, and silver blonde hair pulled back simply. There was something about her tired but peaceful expression that made him pause. "You know what?" David said softly, surprising himself. "Don't worry about it. I can take another seat. I don't want to disturb the little one." Margaret's eyes widened. "Are you certain?" "I can move if you just give me a moment." "Please, stay." David smiled and gestured to the middle seat. "I'll sit here. It's no trouble at all." As David settled beside her, Margaret felt a wave of relief. "That's very kind of you. This is my granddaughter, Emma. She's been fussy all morning." And she finally fell asleep just before boarding. "I was terrified of waking her." David nodded, understanding in his expression. "I remember those days." "How old is she?" 4 months. "My daughter had an emergency at work. She's a nurse, so I've been helping out this week. I'm heading home now." The plane began to taxi, and they sat in comfortable silence for a moment. David pulled out his laptop, then hesitated and put it away. Something about this woman's presence was calming. After the week he'd had, board meetings, difficult decisions, late nights reviewing contracts, perhaps he needed this moment of quiet humanity. "I'm David, by the way," he said, extending his hand. "Margaret." "It's nice to meet you, David." As the plane climbed into the sky, Emma stirred slightly. Margaret began to hum a soft lullaby, barely audible, but David caught the familiar melody. His own mother used to sing that song. "My mother sang that too," he said quietly. "I haven't heard it in years." Margaret smiled. "It's an old one. I sang it to my own children and now to Emma. Some things are worth keeping." David found himself opening up in a way he rarely did with strangers. Perhaps it was the altitude, or the anonymity of being 30,000 feet above the earth. Or maybe it was simply Margaret's gentle, non-judgmental presence. "I've been so focused on work lately," he admitted. "I run a software company. We're expanding, hiring hundreds of people, and there's always another decision to make, another crisis to solve. Sometimes I forget what really matters." Margaret listened, not interrupting, just nodding with understanding. "I lost my mother 2 years ago," David continued, his voice softer now. "She always told me that success meant nothing if you lost your humanity. Along the way, I think about that often, especially in meetings when I have to decide things that affect people's lives, their jobs, their families." "She sounds like a wise woman," Margaret said. "And it sounds like you're trying to honor her values. That's not easy in the business world." "No, it's not." David paused. "Can I ask you something? You seem so peaceful, even exhausted and traveling alone with a baby. How do you do it?" Margaret looked down at Emma, stroking her soft hair. "I suppose I've learned that life isn't about the big moments we plan for. It's about showing up for the small ones." This week wasn't glamorous. Changing diapers, midnight feedings, walking the floor when Emma couldn't sleep. But these are the moments that matter. She won't remember them, but I will. And maybe in some small way, the love gets stored up inside her for later. David felt something shift in his chest. When was the last time he'd thought about life that way? Emma woke then, blinking her bright eyes and looking around with infant curiosity. She gazed up at David and, to Margaret's surprise, reached out a tiny hand toward him. "Would you like to hold her?" Margaret asked. "I could use a moment to stretch." David hesitated. It's been a long time. It comes back to you, Margaret assured him. Carefully, David took Emma into his arms. The baby settled against him, and he felt that familiar weight, that complete trust. His own children were teenagers now, busy with their own lives. When had they stopped needing him like this? I've been working so much, David said quietly, more to himself than to Margaret, that I've missed dinners. School events, bedtime stories. My daughter asked me last week if I even remembered what grade she was in. He shook his head. She was joking, but it stung because there was truth in it. Margaret reached over and gently patted his arm. The beautiful thing about children is that it's never too late. They're resilient, and they want your presence more than your perfection. My husband traveled constantly when our kids were young. When he finally slowed down, he worried he'd missed too much. But you know what? Our kids just remember that he came back, that he chose them eventually. David looked at her with grateful eyes. Thank you for saying that. They talked for the rest of the flight, about life, about regrets and hopes, about the way time moves differently as you age, faster and yet somehow more precious. Margaret shared stories of her grandchildren, her garden, the book club she'd joined. David talked about his fears of becoming irrelevant to his own family, his desire to create a company culture that valued people over profits. You know, David said as the plane began its descent, I came on this trip to scout a new office location. I was going to spend the weekend in meetings, checking out buildings, reviewing spreadsheets, but I think I'm going to do something different instead. Oh? Margaret smiled knowingly. I'm going to call my kids, really talk to them. And on Monday, I'm going to implement something. I've been considering a mentorship program at my company, pairing experienced employees with younger ones. Not just for skills, but for wisdom, the kind of thing you've shared with me today. Margaret's eyes misted slightly. That sounds wonderful, David. As they gathered their belongings, David reached into his bag and pulled out a business card. I know this might seem strange, but I'd like to stay in touch. What you've shared today, it reminded me of what my mother tried to teach me. I don't want to forget it again. Margaret took the card, then pulled out a small notebook and wrote down her email address. I'd like that very much. And if you ever need reminding about what matters, you just write to me. They parted ways at the gate, David heading to ground transportation, Margaret waiting for her connection. But before he left, David turned back. Margaret? Thank you. For letting me sit in your seat. For letting me hold Emma. For reminding me what it means to be human. Margaret smiled, that warm, knowing smile. We were exactly where we needed to be. David, sometimes the universe, puts us in the wrong seat for exactly the right reason. 6 months later, Margaret received a package in the mail. Inside was a beautiful framed photograph of David with his 2 teenagers, all 3 smiling genuinely at the camera. The note read, Dear Margaret, we're having dinners together now. Real conversations. My daughter is teaching me about her music, and my son and I started hiking on weekends. The mentorship program launched last month, and we've paired 50 employees so far. They're calling it the Margaret Initiative, though I haven't told them why. Thank you for that flight. Thank you for reminding me that sometimes the detours are the destination. With gratitude always, David. Margaret placed the photo on her mantel, right next to the pictures of her own grandchildren. She thought about that afternoon on the plane, how a simple act of kindness, David giving up his seat, both of them choosing conversation over silence, had rippled outward into changed lives. That evening, as she rocked Emma during another visit to her daughter's house, Margaret hummed that old lullaby and smiled. Life, she thought, wasn't about the seats we're assigned. It's about the grace we show when plans change, the connections we make in unexpected moments, and the wisdom we choose to share. The wrong seat had been exactly right after all.